I think alternative and mainstream in comics only apply within the industry.
We can give the creators the rights that the bigger companies always take from them.
I was selling the book and someone came up and said, "You can't do this."
Most people know the work of only two comic book companies, Marvel and DC. But there are dozens of smaller companies and even individuals that publish comic books every day.
People tend to think of comics, if they understand the comics business at all, they tend to think of it in two different fashions, one being mainstream and one being alternative indie. And, you know, they tend to think that all mainstream comics are cosmic superhero battles, and all indie comics are navel-gazing slacker dudes.
I think alternative and mainstream in comics only apply within the industry. In the general culture, there's comics. There's no mainstream or independent.
I think what you're mostly talking about is a corporate, non-corporate environment. That's the division, and that's where we are an alternative publisher relative to DC Comics, which is owned by Time Warner, and they're a mainstream publisher.
I think a lot of cartoonists use the term alternative to sort of disassociate themselves from Marvel and DC. Or to, at least in people's minds, to most cartoonists, what it really means is there are the superheroes, and then there's us. That's kind of what it means.
When you hear comic books, the name that usually comes to mind is Stan Lee. But while Robert Crumb is a name you may not know, his work has affected artists all over the world since he hit the scene in the 1960s.
Robert Crumb is the underground. You can argue about who the first underground cartoonist was, but Robert Crumb is the underground cartoonist in the same way that Ingmar Bergman is the Scandinavian film director or what have you. But Robert Crumb is the guy who really defined it.
He was one of the first people to figure out that he could do comics that were just completely, as he put it, tearing the lid off the id. Direct expressions of whatever he had in his brain, that he didn't have to worry about selling them as children's entertainment, that they could be sold to an audience of older adult aficionados.
While I was going to art school, not exactly sure what I wanted to do until I came across some old comics of Robert Crumb's. And I'd seen his art before, but I'd never seen one of the comics he had done where he took the traditional comic book format and did all the artwork from cover to cover. And when I saw that, I immediately knew exactly what I wanted to do.
I visited him one time up in his home when he was living in Northern California with his wife. I remember he was being yelled at a lot. He was doing a strip about this character called Eggs Ackley and the demon vulturesses. And he seemed to almost take a verbatim the way Eggs Ackley was being attacked by the demon vulturesses, the way he was being attacked by his wife during the meal earlier. And I thought that was just amazing. And the speed that he was doing this, and without any errors, he did like an entire page in like just a couple of hours.
When you compare him to all the people that were imitating him and trying to do the same thing, trying to be shocking by being explicitly sexual and talk about drugs and overthrowing the government and all that kind of stuff, other people just weren't as good at it because they didn't have his talent. He was just such a funny writer and such a fantastic artist.
He has a phenomenal imagination, and he draws like the hand of God, and he's absolutely unsparing with his own psyche. You don't get the sense that he does any of his comics to pump himself up, even his autobiographical comics. It's all about casting a cold, withering analytical, very funny eye at himself and his psyche and the darkest parts of his own brain, which is really admirable, and it's gorgeous to look at.
Although superhero appearances in alternative comics are rare, they do occur. Chris Ware's Jimmy Corrigan, the smartest kid on Earth, uses a Superman homage as a symbol for the main character's absent father. Peter Bagge has been working as a cartoonist for decades, and he's worked with some of the biggest names in comics. But the work that he's best known for is his series Hate.
One of the first publications to run my work on a fairly regular basis was a porno tabloid called Screw. And after that, I started appearing pretty regularly in a magazine called Weirdo, which was an underground comic anthology. And it was edited by my hero, Robert Crumb, so that was a big thrill to work with him. And then after a while, he made me the managing editor of Weirdo. This is back in the 80s. All through the 90s, I devoted myself almost exclusively to this comic called Hate. Right at that time, a number of things happened to me in my personal life. I was married by then, bought a house, had a kid. All of a sudden, all these aspects of my past, of being a renter and living in cheap, filthy apartments and not having much money and having to drag my dirty clothes to the laundromat, all of those things were very much in my past. When you're in the midst of something like that, it's pretty hard to laugh about it or look at it objectively. You know, it's not very funny when you're in the middle of this crap. But now that it was all behind me, it suddenly was hilarious. Well, a more recent comic book I've been working on is this 6-part miniseries called Apocalypse Nerd. It's about this computer nerd, middle-aged computer nerd, who, while on a camping trip, winds up discovering that his hometown, which again is Seattle, had been nuked by the North Koreans. So he can't go back home, so him and his friend are stuck in the woods trying to survive. And it's all me just putting myself in that situation and how I'd survive. And of course, when I think about it, if I'm honest with myself, I know I would do terrible. Spend a lot of time crying, and so does this character.
Deciding to self-publish is a big step. It takes discipline and money. But even before that, you need a good idea, one that gets attention.
My name is Matthew Muhammad. I'm a writer. I write comic books. I concentrate on my own title, an independent title called Black Bastard, which I publish myself. The original product for Black Bastard wasn't a comic book, it was a t-shirt. And we went to Wizard World Chicago, and we were selling the shirt, and everyone's, where's the comic? Where's the comic? Okay, we're gonna make one. The first line of each comic is, "Welcome to the city of Niggeropolis," and it just sets the tone right off the bat. It's a satire based on the exploits of a high school guidance counselor. And he dismisses counsel to students in need. Like, there's one issue where he gives the girl contact info for the local strip club as she turns 18. So, I mean, like, he's there for his students. We make fun of, like, I guess the usual stereotypes, but like I try and do it for everybody. And so each issue has a different theme and everything like that. And the latest issue we did was the anthology, where we had like 11 different stories featuring artwork from 20 different artists. It was so spectacular that we had to call it the Blacktacular. The feedback initially was so positive and so overwhelming that when the negative feedback did come, I was like, what's wrong with you, man? Don't you have a sense of humor? And what you have to understand, too, is when I started doing this, there was no Family Guy, there was no American Dad, there was The Simpsons and South Park, right? So, like, it wasn't out there the way it is now. Now my book seems tame in comparison to what these television shows do. I remember I was selling the book and someone came up and said, "You can't do this. You can't do this," a black guy. I gave him the comic book and I said, "Read it, try and see where I'm coming from." And he read it and he says, "I can see where you're coming from, but I still think it's something that you just don't do." I think I quoted him, Jonathan Swift, where he talks about a satirical solution to like poverty and children being born into poverty, where they would eat the children of the poor. And like a lot of people took it at face value and they were outraged by it, but it was satirical. It wasn't meant the way it was written. And that's the thing I have to understand about satire is not everyone gets it. It's 100% wrong, but 110% fun.
The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was a political movement in America in the 60s. To avoid controversy, writer Roy Thomas changed Black Panther's name temporarily to Black Leopard to distance the comic hero from the politics of the group. Who are two of the biggest alternative publishers out there? And what has the web done to and for the alternative press? Find out when we return. They've published works by the Hernandez brothers and Robert Crumb, as well as introducing new faces to the alternative scene. Fantagraphics has made a name for itself by publishing whatever it wants.
Fantagraphics is basically an alternative comics publisher. So we publish comic books and graphic novels and comic strip collections.
Fantagraphics is the publisher of the world's greatest cartoonists. And I say world's greatest cartoonists because it's more than just comics. It's sort of the whole spectrum of cartooning. And you know, rather than specialize in a particular genre or any kind of subject matter, we mostly just focus on really good cartooning, whether it be someone who does, you know, contemporary comic books or graphic novels or old-time comic strips or great animators from the past or what have you.
I think the main thing that sets us apart from mainstream publishers is that we respect the vision of the individual artist more than mainstream publishers do. Mainstream publishers tend to have this format, these genre constrictions within which the cartoonists are expected to work, whereas we give our cartoonists complete carte blanche to do whatever they please.
Well, needless to say, alternative comics were able to do, or cartoonists were able to do a lot more than anybody working for Marvel or DC could, because they had almost complete creative freedom. Like with Fantagraphics, I could probably count on one hand the number of times that I know of that they either told me or anybody not to do this, that, or the other thing. And it was usually just to avoid a lawsuit.
A few cartoonists that we publish do need a little bit of guidance, but for the most part, cartoonists will bring us a piece of work and say, do you want to publish this, yes or no? And then everything else is just production details. Part of the appeal of publishing the work we do is that you can't really define it in one sentence. It's really all over the map. I mean, there's deadly serious work, there's satirical work, there's just outright funny work, there's genre fiction.
I don't think you really could look at a comic and know it's a Fantagraphics comic, you know, based on the style of drawing or the content of the comic. We tend to publish a pretty wide range of stuff, you know, from the most accessible, you know, kind of mass market thing like Peanuts to, you know, really idiosyncratic and existential stuff by Crumb. And on the surface, you know, there's not a lot of common ground between the two other than it's just exceptional work.
I really don't know what we look for until we see it. I realize that's sort of like a circular response, but there's any number of books that we really like that we publish that, you know, if the day before we received that book in the mail, you would have asked us, are you looking for something like that? We would have, you know, just looked at you blankly. I mean, we published, for instance, a book that's basically a fantasy fairy tale book called Castle Waiting. And that's not something that really falls within Gary's and my normal purview of tastes. And yet, when we saw the work, we were just enthralled by it. And actually, when we announced it, there was some eyebrow raising. It didn't seem to fit typically within the normal Fantagraphics formula, which was, in fact, yet another reason to do it.
They do a bit of everything, from Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Star Wars to Mike Mignola's Hellboy. Dark Horse Comics is a company that bridges the gap between commercial and art house publishing by publishing both.
Dark Horse Comics is a publishing company that began in 1986. It was created out of a desire to create comics on our own. I never meant it to be the big company that it's become.
One of the things we started with, because we knew we couldn't compete with Marvel or DC, was we thought we can give the creators the rights that the bigger companies always take from them. Let the creators retain their copyrights on their characters so that if something happens down the line and the character's made into a movie or TV series or a line of action figures or whatever, they can benefit from that, that expansion into the other markets.
My experience with Dark Horse has been fantastic. I don't know another publisher who, would have just said, we want you to do a book for us. They didn't ask what it was. I told them, well, it's going to be called Hellboy. They said, great. They didn't ask what it meant. They didn't ask what it looked like. They didn't ask anything. They just said, we like you. We trust you. Go do your book.
They're very hands-off. Mike Richardson, I think in many ways, is a patron of the arts in that degree. He really admires, he understands the business of the arts, but he really admires an individual voice and really lets you do exactly what you want to do.
The whole business model of a small independent publisher that publishes a variety of material that allows top talent to own its own creations. A lot of companies kind of learned that from us. Not to say that nobody had thought of that before us, but we made it work in ways that nobody else did. The other guys who tried it aren't around anymore, so obviously we were doing something right.
One of the great advantages, it's a very small publisher. So Hellboy becomes a big fish in a small pond as opposed to one of a billion books that Marvel or DC is putting out. I mean, if I were to do a book like this at Marvel or at DC, would I have to have my character interact with Batman and stuff like that? I mean, Dark Horse, we did a couple little experiments like that, crossover with this character, crossover with that character, but they were fun little things. It was always clear that Hellboy was mine.
We were the place that Frank Miller and John Byrne came to when they were at the very top of the industry and wanted to do something real different, wanted to do the books that they were meant to do and own them and have complete control over them. And now there's a lot more opportunities like that, but we were the ones that really kind of laid the groundwork.
Robert Crumb has created many stories and characters over his career, but is likely best known for drawing himself. His brutally honest work regarding his relationship with women is captured in the title and cover of My Troubles with Women. Comics on the web are by no means a new idea, but Transmission X has a unique approach to the idea of web publishing and publicity. Find out more when we return. From the autobiographical to the highly illogical, the alternative press covers all kinds of subjects. Here's a sample of the work that's out there. This is Comics 101. Josh Simmons' House is a classic ghost story about 3 adventurous kids and one giant abandoned mansion in a remote area. The story is truly chilling and is told through pictures, as not a single word is uttered in the entire book. Chester Brown's Louis Riel is a historic biography of one of the most controversial characters in Canadian history. Leader of the Northwest Rebellion in 1885, Riel has been seen as both traitor and hero, madman and saint. American Splendor is the autobiographical work of Harvey Pekar. Pekar's ability to tell such an honest story and capture funny and painful moments of his life has made this one of the biggest comics to hit the indie scene. A collective is not a new idea, but a web collective to generate comic books and publish new material on a weekly basis. Well, that's what Transmission X is all about.
I think the goal and mission of Transmission X is it's an avenue, it's a showcase for us to put the ideas that we want to tell, the stories that we want to tell out there to garner an audience. And the web is a great vehicle for that because it's accessible worldwide.
Transmission X started, I guess, out of a dissatisfaction with doing artwork for other people. Even though I've been lucky enough to work on projects that generally I've been excited about and that I enjoy, there's still that sense within you that you want to do something that's yours, something that you've created that's a story that you want to tell.
Right now is a labor of love. Basically, one day a week, you're working for free. Hopefully, we're going to get enough of a fan base that we can start doing things with, things like advertising or merchandising on the site. A lot of this stuff we're still talking about because I think we all really feel as a collective that you need to have enough of an audience to make some of this stuff happen.
Webcomics is very much a word of mouth kind of linking kind of community that grows. And we hope eventually to take Transmission X to the place where we can put editions out of the comics, whether it be anthology-wise or individually,
People want just instant access to things, and that's the web for you. So I think the future of comics is definitely, at least in part, on the web. Even though my love is books and it is paper, and I love buying things on paper, so probably I'll end up collecting loose into a book.
We're really just trying to make webcomics expand sort of the viewership of webcomics and the impact that they have within the comics community. And then afterwards, from there, what I'm really hoping is that Transmission X will be sort of a forum for people who don't normally read comics to find a type of comic online that they would like to read.
I think most of us with the Transmission X comics, we've decided to kind of keep our storytelling methods very classic, like Michael Cho, who does your 6:9 ratio. But many of the other guys have gone landscape to fit the monitor screen or the shape.
It's really fun. It's very liberating to work that way, and it's a unique challenge as well to sit down every week, because I work on it basically one day out of the week. I sit down and try to come up with something that works as a page. I mean, it's all part of a larger story, but I have to come up with something that feels complete, that gives the readers a satisfying chunk of the story for that week, that ends on a dramatic note that is compelling enough that the reader will return the following week, to propel the story a little bit in 8 short panels. You know, it's a whole host of creative challenges.
Each day of the week has a different strip. I put on Sunday especially because it feels like, you know, you're getting that Sunday strip in the newspaper, and it sort of has that feel to it. And I think that's what makes it fun and good.
As far as I'm concerned, I think what stands out is our quality and our real consistent effort to doing something that we genuinely care about. There's a real feeling of a uniform sort of sense of loving comics and really wanting to do something that's good and cool and show that comics aren't the niche sort of market that mainstream comics feel like.
With new technology and the world at our fingertips, self-publishing is easier now than ever before. But whether you're doing it online or on paper, getting your work to cut through has never been more challenging. And just maybe, that's a good thing.